Hi, everybody. My name is Inga Bjornsdottir. I'm an anthropologist, and I have specialized, among other things, in Icelandic women in the Americas. And one of those women that I've studied and written a book about, biography about, is Olof the Eskimo lady, who was one of America's most well-known imposter in late 19th, early 20th century. Olof, as you see here on the cover of my book that was published in Icelandic, is dressed up as an Eskimo, but that's what he pretended to be. So Olof was born in Iceland, northern part of Iceland, into a very poor family in a very poor country. And what made things worse was that her father, who was a small farmer, was a very bad farmer. He didn't take interest in farming. He, there you say Iceland in the summer, and there you see her father, and he was a very attractive man, and people liked him a lot. He was a great poet, he was a drunk, he was a womanizer, a horseman, but he was not a good farmer. And what happened in the end was that her family was split up. He couldn't take care of his 7 children. And so they were all sent into foster care, and their future actually was very bleak. And he himself became a farmhand. However, what saved him was that the American agents, both from Canada and from the US, came to Iceland recruiting immigrants to come and move from Iceland to Canada or America, and offering them a free trip across the ocean, as well as farming land. And they were offering Icelanders land either in North Dakota or Manitoba. And that's where her father decided to go, because he saw this as an opportunity to reunite his family, his children. And in the meantime, however, his wife had passed away. The Olaf's mother had been in an accident, and so he had remarried, and off they went, 7 children, some young. Olaf was 18 at the time, and they sailed off with another group of Icelanders. Over 20,000 Icelanders altogether emigrated to America during this period. And they sailed to Scotland, and from there they went on a big steamer across the ocean to Quebec City in Canada. That's where they landed. And then, you know, they were heading for Manitoba. But on the boat with the all those immigrants, future immigrants to America, Olaf, of course, you know, gained their attention because he was a dwarf. And then during her trip over, she told everybody that she was going to go to America because he was going to be rich and famous. She was determined that, and she knew that she was going to be rich and famous in America. And this, of course, caused them to laugh and joke about her, because how could she as a dwarf become a famous person in America? But actually that's what happened. So, you know, on the way to Manitoba, they stopped over in Toronto and spent a few days in Toronto. And that's where, in Toronto, Olaf went to a Curiosa Museum. And in the Curiosa Museum, there was a couple, a dwarf couple, who were showing off, and people were paying them some money for the display. And there she got an idea. This was what she could do. this is what she would do when she came to America, when she had settled in America. So off they went over to Manitoba, and they settled in an area called what was called New Iceland. It was an uninhabited area close by Lake Winnipeg. And to make a long story short, it was a horrible place. It was filled with it was woody, filled with trees. There were no trees in Iceland. They had no experience in living in a wooded area or building homes from wood. Icelanders, they could fish in this Lake Winnipeg, but the fish there, the nets that they needed, everything, nothing worked out. And it turned out also that New Iceland and Canada is much colder than Iceland in the winter. You know, it may sound strange, but that's how it was. Anyway, they built a log cabin and managed to survive the first winter. But the second year there, you know, there was a smallpox outbreak in New Iceland, and it was quarantined. And it was quarantined for almost a year. And, you know, the government of Manitoba, you supplied them with food and other needs, but still over 100 Icelanders died during that period, that year. And then when immediately after the quarantine was lifted, Olof left. This was not her dream of America. She left for Winnipeg. And there she worked as a maid in a well-to-do home. And, you know, she had to stand up on a stool to do the dishes, but that was not her dream, though. That was not what she wanted. And when she heard that there was a traveling circus from America, you know, coming to Winnipeg, she immediately went there, got hired, and started her new life with the circus. She ran away with the circus into the States and never came back to Canada. She never saw any of her family members again. She started a completely new life. And that's where she realized her dream, her first dream, would you say? And she became you know, displayed herself as the wife of another dwarf. And of course, she never married, and there was nothing in between them except this. That was their work. So she traveled with the worked for the circus for close to 5 years. She traveled, you know, from town to town, where they, you know, were displayed. But in the winter time, she couldn't work. I mean, the circus was closed, so she had to earn a living. And the way what she did, she became a waitress in hotels in different towns. And you know, when people saw her, she not only was she small, being a dwarf, she also spoke with a distinct accent. So people would ask her, "Where are you from?" And she would say, "I'm from Iceland." And many customers would respond and say, "Oh, really? You're from Iceland? I've never seen an Eskimo before." And this offended Olof at first, because Icelanders, like all other Europeans and Americans probably too, are considered the Eskimos in Greenland or Eskimos in general as savages. And she was not proud, you know, didn't like the fact that thought she was one of them. However, what happened was that one day, a minister from a Baptist church, when she was staying in Cloverdale, Indiana, he came and asked her if she would like to come to his congregation and give a lecture about her life in Greenland. And she was very reluctant. At first, she almost turned his offer down, but then he offered to pay her $5 for it. And that, you know, $5 was a lot of money. So she accepted the offer. She went home to her room and turned out to have a great imagination and started telling this fabulous story that she made up about her life in Greenland and Iceland and then in America. and her lecture was a huge success. So, and then, the reputation of Olof spread around, and the people were she got all this demand to give lectures in other places, in other congregations, in other halls around the Midwest, and she quit the circus and started doing that full time, or in the summer, of course, again. Anyway, the reason why there was so much interest in her lecture was because at the time, Robert E. Peary, the American, was fighting, he was trying to be the first man to reach the North Pole through Greenland. And Americans took great interest in his race to the North Pole. And historians have later said that their interest in his race, Robert E. Peary's race, was similar to that when the Americans were racing to be the first to land a man on the moon. So, and here you see him, he spent years in Greenland and wrote books about it, took him a long time. He finally officially reached the North Pole in 1909, but he spent decades in Greenland and exploring Greenland and, finally getting supposedly to the North Pole. And so he is here on the ship dressed up as a native, and Olof dressed up like this too, and that's at the beginning of her career. This is what she did. This is a poster for one of her lectures, and you see she is in a fake a polarstern outfit with kind of a background that looks like icebergs and the Northern Lights. And you wonder, what did she say? Why was she so popular? What did she tell the people? And she told them that she had been born up in a very in the very tip of northeastern Greenland, way up up in northeastern Greenland. Anyway, and she said she lived in a little town, a little village, basically on the coast. She was raised in an igloo, and life was very dull in Greenland. She said she had Eskimo children, especially girls, had to sit inside all year round. It was too cold to play outside. They had to have their arms folded. They had to sit by the fire, and the fact they had their arms folded was because that was why her arms were so short. However, she said that the boys, Eskimo boys, were able to go out fishing with their father and hunting, so they had straight arms, but not Eskimo girls. So she also told them that basically all the Eskimos were really white, but with like blonde hair, but they didn't take a bath, and that explained why they were, dark-skinned and had dark hair. And actually, she used this as an excuse later on to stop wearing outfits as an Eskimo. And she was really open and blunt about the fact that she was just white like everybody else. And she also told them that she was a tall lady for being an Eskimo. She was unusually tall. Eskimos were very small. And another things that she said that people really liked or would laugh at, she told them, Christian missionaries should not go to Greenland to try to convert the Eskimos to Christianity, because they would start sinning, because they were dying to get into the warmth of hell, because it was so cold over there. So anyway, she also told in the story that a group of 6 Icelandic fishermen had, been whale hunting outside her coast, and the ship had stranded, and they ended up spending a year in her village. And a year later, they decided to return to Iceland. They asked her father if they could borrow her sledges and dogs to go on ice back to Iceland. And her father accepted, the request. He said, but then he decided to go along, to take his family along on the trip to Iceland because he wanted to make sure that he got his dogs back. So off they went, Ólöf and their whole family. But instead, they stayed there for a few years. She learned Icelandic there. She said she also learned how to read and write. And then her father, instead of moving back to Greenland, decided to join a group of Icelanders who were emigrating to Canada. And then she said told them too that, her father was a poor man. He couldn't go there with his whole family, but picked her because he was his favorite child. And the reason why, she said, but she was giving those lectures, telling her story, was because he was raising funds to pay for the trip for the rest of her family that was still in Iceland. So anyway, she was traveling, giving lectures, and then a writer and journalist, Albert S. Post, he listened to her, giving her lecture, and he was so impressed that he decided to write it down and publish it as a book. And that kind of was widely read book, became actually very popular. So, and that happened in 1887. And this, actually, this publication, her reputation, of course, but especially the publication of this book was a real game changer in Ólaf's life. Because what happened was Henry Sladen, who was a Lyceum Bureau owner and lived in Chicago. He and his wife ran a Lyceum Bureau, Amina and Henry, the Sladen Lyceum Bureau, and they were always on the outlook for talents. And the story, I have to tell you here is that at this time, of course, Americans did not have a radio, they didn't have TV, as you all know, they didn't have films. Basically, all the information about the world, they got through books or newspapers or pamphlets and print media in various forms. But what happened then was that in the summertime, there were a group of distinguished lecturers, that would travel from town to town and give lectures during the so-called Chautauqua week. It was sometimes the highlight of the summer in those towns. And there's a group of artists of all kinds, scholars, scientists, storytellers, and you name it, that would come. And there would be this lecture series, this entertainment for a whole week, often, in public parks, sometimes in tents as well, and so on. And they were running this Lyceum Bureau, Henry and Mina. And the one reason why it was they founded it was because Mina was, she was a singer and a reader. She was a very distinguished New England lady. Both of them were New Englanders who had moved to Chicago after the Civil War. So there you see them. And so Henry went up and listened to Ólöf give her lecture, and he was so impressed that after he heard the story, he went backstage and offered her not only to become her agent, he also offered her to move in with him and his wife and son in Chicago. And of course, Ólöf was deeply happy about that and accepted that offer right away. And off she went, and she ended up living with the Sladen family for 31 years. So here you have them, and this is the building, where the Lyceum Bureau was, a very stately building in Chicago. And this was a big move up for Ólöf in her life. She was not only living in a mansion in a very nice neighborhood, she was also being served by a maid. Not this time around, she was not the maid. So anyway, and then, like I said before, she told everybody that they were Eskimos were blonde and blue-eyed and really, white-skinned. And so she soon stopped wearing this cumbersome costume, dressing up as an Eskimo, because she loved dressing up, giving her lectures. And she, there is another one, and in one of the reviews about her lecture, the lecture, the critic, or like the guy who wrote the review, said, she had been wearing all this very expensive gold. And so, and Olof was not alone, of course. He traveled around in a group of other lecturers that the Slayton represented. And, they had a long list of very distinguished lecturers, scientists, and so on. And I will, of the time, but I will name only two here, or three, that are still very well known. Some of those names have disappeared, but many of them are very well known, of course, today. And this is Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony, the suffragettes, the women who fought for decades for women's rights to vote. And the Slaytons organized their lecture trips through the Midwest. And another famous lecturer that they represented was William Denning Bryan. And he and Olof actually, in one of his, in his papers, he talks about Olof and their collaboration or traveling together. And he, was run as a presidential candidate for the Democrats in 1896. He lost, but then he gave a speech called the Cross of Gold, that is considered by historians one of the best speeches ever given in Icelandic American history. So that's, so she lived in great comfort in Chicago with the Slaytons. She traveled during the summer, the lecture series, and then she just spent the winters with the family. Anyway, the interest in the Eskimos, in the race, in Greenland, in the people of Greenland, and so on, was very, very high. There was great demand for stories about Greenland. And so teachers in American schools, started demanding the publication of a book about children in Greenland. And so the Rand McNally publishing house, the biggest publishing house of textbooks in America, that happened to be located in Chicago, and they decided to publish a book, a textbook, and they hired a teacher called Mary Smith to write the book. And she was not only a teacher, she was also a poet. So she wrote the text of the book in a rhyme, and it was called Eskimo Stories, and it was based on on two major books. That was one of them was my Arctic Journal by Josephine Perry, Perry's wife. She spent some time with him in Greenland and lived among the natives and observed the children, and she wrote about them in her book. And also the other man who book that they used was written by Frederick Swartkamp and was called Children of the Cold. He was a medical doctor and a colonel in the military, and he had spent time among the Eskimos in Alaska. So those were the two main texts of on which the main text of this Eskimo Stories. That's it. This is it. A little fuzzy picture, but still, this is one edition of this book because it was in use for decades. And there are many different versions of this publication. Anyway, the Rand McNally, the editors there, decided that to get Olof, the native Chicagoan, the only real Eskimo that was living in America at the time, to read through the text of this book. So they did. They got her to read, and she was very happy. she had many comments apparently and some corrections, not everything was correct what those white Americans were saying. And then they decided to publish a chapter from her book, and her biography at the end of the book. And in the introduction, Mary Smith recommends and tells teachers they should let their students start out reading the text by Olof because that was written by a real Eskimo. So, so this was, this was published in 1900. This book. So this was, 9 years before the Pierre reached the North Pole. And, like I said, this book was in circulation until World War II in American schools. So, and the interesting thing, though, is that her story was not only being used in schools, also at universities, especially teachers' colleges, including Columbia University, Graduate School of Education. And that the teachers there, they read Olaf's work, Olaf's book, to use as teachers in the class. Anyway, this is very ironic because at the same time, the most famous anthropologist of the time, Franz Boas, he was a professor at Columbia, and he was a specialist in Eskimos in Alaska. But they were not reading his text, but Olaf's, because he was the real one. So anyway, in 1909, actually the same year as Perry reached the North Pole, the Slaytons decided to sell their bureau, the Lyceum Bureau. They've been running it since 1873, so this was a long time, almost 30 years. So they decided to sell it, and actually they got a great offer and sold it to one of America's biggest Lyceum Bureau at the time, the Red Path Bureau in Boston. And it may have been a coincidence, it may not, but the final sale, the finalization of the sale took place on Olaf's birthday, February 15th, 1909, when she turned 51. And it may have been a coincidence, but it may also have been, done because she had been one of the golden goose. She had been giving lectures all over America. She gave over 2,500 lectures. She went to many of those places again and again. Her lectures sold out, and her lectures were reviewed in all the major papers. Her text, people quoted her books, like in Harper's Magazine, in Atlantic, and other articles on Eskimos at this time. Where she was one of the major source for information about the natives of Greenland. And this, as I say, was all because Perry was competing and actually turned out to be, even though it started to be the first one to reach the North Pole. So anyway, after they sold the bureau, they decided to go and move to St. Petersburg in Florida. Florida was at this time opening up as a destination, a warm destination for wealthy Northeasterners and Midwesterners, and thanks to the building of the railroad. And so they went down there, and Slayton, being a very, a good businessman, he bought a big part of land in the middle of town, across the main square in the town. And they were going to build an apartment hotel on that location. And so what happened, though, a year after they moved down there, Henry went back to Chicago for a visit and doing some business. And he got a heart attack and died, and he was 69 years old at the time. And this was a major blow to the family, of course. But Mina had always been involved in business with her husband. She was the instigator, actually, of the founding of the office anyway. So they decided to go ahead. Mina and Wendell, her son, who was with them, of course, he was Aunt Olof. And so they went ahead and they opened up this residential hotel called Seven Gables. And you see that here in the picture. And it soon became most of the sought after place to stay in St. Petersburg at the time. And Olof, she thrived in St. Petersburg. I think it was like some of her best years. Here you see her on her birthday, dressed up in a white linen dress with a bouquet of flowers and a very nice hairdo. She apparently really liked dressing up. But in the summertime, actually, she did, for her first years down in Florida, she did travel and give lectures still about Greenland and life of the Eskimos in the South. Went up to Atlanta and so on and so forth. So she did that in the summer. In the winter, she helped out running the Seven Gables, and actually her specialty became to be the electrician. And in the City Registry of St. Petersburg from 1915, she is listed as an electrician. So she must have learned how to do that. Electricity was quite new at the time. And I'm sure she was clever, and she was, it was easy for her to learn new things. So that's what she did. So she stayed there for, happily with Wendell and Mina for several years. However, what happened was that their son, Wendell, he married a, distinguished woman too, called Hilda Jessen, and she moved in with the family. And that was a big blow to Olof, because Hilda, she couldn't stand Olof. She couldn't stand her, and and she wanted her to leave the home. And in the end, she told Wendell if she was not sent away, she would leave him. So of course, Olof was let go, and this was a major shock for Olof. She had to go off, and Mina found her a place to live in Battle Creek, Michigan. That's where she went back to the cold winter. And, and she lived there for 9 years with a very, nice family, very friendly people. But, this is the only time in her life that you can feel that she felt very insecure, her life as an imposter. Apparently, people said that, when they met her, she would immediately start telling them her story of, being an Eskimo, all her life story. And then she would add, I was really surprised when I discovered that Americans lied. She said, in Greenland, no one ever lies. They always tell the truth. They don't know the concept of lying. So anyway, and then she stayed there for those years. And then she got old. She moved into a old Baptist people's home for women in Maywood, south of Chicago. At this time, Wendell had sold the Seven Gables. Mina had passed away, and the crash had hit. The building, the Seven Gables building had been hit by a hurricane. So he was kind of out of his luck in a way. That he had divorced Hilda, but he took very good care of Olof. He was very fond of Olof always. He grew up with her, and she was like, she was a member of his family. So this was she lived in comfort in this old people's home until she died 7 days before her 77th birthday. And then she was buried in Oakwood Cemetery. It's another town close to Maywood. And there you see her name, Ólöf, and she had picked up this name Krarer as a last name. Of course, she didn't want to use her Icelandic last name, Bjornsdottir, which would have given her away right away, and she just made up this name because for her it sounded it could be an Eskimo language or Greenlandic. So anyway, she was born in 1858 in Iceland, and she, as a dwarf, and then an Icelander, but she died in America in 1935 as an Eskimo. Actually, she had really realized her dream and had been very successful and lived, in circumstances and in surroundings that were way higher up and better off than her own family enjoyed in America. I tell about her family in the book about her. So anyway, so there she go, and actually she went on her death certificate. In the first one, at least, she was said to be an Eskimo. And immediately the day after her death, there was an announcement in Chicago Tribune. Even though she had been away for a long time, people still remembered her, and and she got this notice in the paper. So, now you wonder, and this is like, was she ever found out? And the answer in her lifetime, no, she was never found out. And you wonder why? And did people not know? And I think actually that these Ladons knew. I have no written evidence about her, that at all, of course, but it's very hard to believe that they didn't know the truth about her background. And her physical features also gave it away that she was not an Eskimo, but she was a dwarf, a white dwarf. Just use those words. So, there are several indications that suggest that this was the case, that they knew. First of all, she didn't only work for them, she lived with them. So they had kept an eye on her day and night. And they also, when she traveled, she always had a chaperone that followed her, also kept an eye on her. And what also is very interesting is that the secretary of the Illusion Bureau, who worked for the Ladons for decades, she said she never saw Ólöf. Ólöf never came to the office. She was the only client or talent that they represented that she didn't take care of, and she did never meet. So that kind of, I think this desire to protect her all the time gives it away. It kind of makes it more likely that they knew they wanted to protect her. But also, I think in the end, they got very secure about her because she kept her storyline straight. So, so they knew, but didn't tell, of course. And then there was a group that knew about her, but they did not want to tell about her. And of course, the Icelanders, the Icelandic community, both in Canada and in America, they knew about her. And they were split about their views about whether she was, about the view of what she was doing. Some people really despised her activities, she was a liar and making millions out of lying. And the other group were kind of proud of her. They thought, that this little uneducated dwarf from Iceland was able to fool all those Americans, especially those wealthy people, good for her. But they decided, even though they were split about the view, they all felt sorry for her and decided just to stay silent about the fact. They didn't want to ruin her life by exposing her. And also, in a way, another reason why was because Icelanders were very proud. They thought they were very, moral and, people in high standing, and they didn't want to expose her as one of them. I think that's kind of, those three factors played a role. And so they didn't tell. However, there was an Icelander, or like a Western Icelander, who was dying to expose Olof for a long time, and he contacted Icelanders that knew her, and he contacted her family to gather information about her, which was very valuable for me, actually, in my research about her life. But they took a promise that he would not be able to publish anything about her until after her death. And Vilhjálmur was an Arctic explorer, a real one. He was born in Canada. He was 20 years younger than Olof. And his parents were actually on the same boat coming over as Olof and her family. He was for a while a big name in Canada as an Arctic explorer until, after 2 scandalous expeditions into the ice, he fell in disgrace and he left Canada and moved to New York and spent the rest of his life writing books and giving lectures about his experience among the Canadian Arctic Eskimos. And he hated the fact that when he met people, they all were quoting Olof's text, telling her stories and so on. And he was dying to publish a book on exposure. And so he actually got an Icelandic woman to help him gathering the information about it. Thorsteina Jackson was her name. Anyway, a year after Olof passed away, you had the book ready. And it was actually a collection of essays. The book consisted of 8 essays, and one of them was about Olof. The title of the book was Adventures in Error. And basically, the purpose of the book was to correct, all kinds of scientific errors, claims made by scientists or people like Olof about things that people believed, but they were not true. So, it's fake science, like we would call today. And apparently, it's still floating around. So anyway, he published the book, and to make a long story short again, nobody took notice, particular notice of the story about Olof in the book. And this book is published in 1936, and the interest in Greenland and the Eskimos and the North Pole had dissipated. Americans had been through a lot, including the World War I, the crash of Wall Street, the Great Depression that was actually going on at the time. So nobody made a fuss about Olof's story. America was full of charlatans anyway, liars and charlatans. And, he thought Olof's tale would be make his book a bookseller, but it didn't. So anyway, and then, but Olof still, I will end on this note. Her legacy is greater than I ever thought. People, they stopped using her book in schools and before World War II, but the ideas of her, about the natives of Greenland stayed alive and passed from one generation to another. And a couple of years ago, I went to a meeting at the Unitarian Society downtown Santa Barbara. And it was a gathering of leaders of different congregations in Santa Barbara, from different, there were Jews, there were Muslims, Christians, Catholics, you name it, they were all there. And the purpose of the meeting was climate change, the fight against climate change. And the attendees, the ministers, the leaders of the congregation all stepped up, gave a short speech, and told the audience why or how and why the congregation had reached the conclusion that they were going to be active in the fight against climate change. And then, this minister from a, evangelical Baptist church downtown Santa Barbara, a very conservative congregation, he stepped up and he said that he and his congregation had not believed in climate change. And so they had, at the beginning, decided not to fight against it. However, he said, when I found out that the ice between Iceland and Greenland had started melting away, and now no one could cross the ice between Iceland and Greenland, that's when he saw this was really happening. Something wrong, seriously wrong was going on. And of course, I don't need to tell you probably, I think most people know there has never ever been an ice sheet that between Iceland and Greenland. We got few icebergs drifting from the Greenland glacier down to Iceland in bad winters. But there's never ever in human history been a ice bridge between Iceland and Greenland. It's only existed in Olaf's imagination. So at the same time, she, you might be really doubt the value of her contribution, but I must say, at least she put her weight, or like her little chip, into the fight against climate change. So this is a story of Olaf, and I published the book in Icelandic, and actually it was a big success. People loved this story about her in Iceland. They were kind of proud of her too. And it has been translated into English. It's called Olof the Eskimo Lady. So it's available on Amazon if you're interested to learn more about this crazy, interesting to me, fascinating woman, because she ended up she was kind of condemned to end up as a mate, as a nobody and as a dwarf, but she was able to redefine herself. She said she was a tall, a normal Eskimo woman, and she was also able to use her incredible talent to both her imagination and apparently her storytelling skills that impressed people, and it's written about in many of the reviews about her lectures. So thank you very much. Mm-hmm.